So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about Conophytums today, my favorite winter-growing succulent plants from South Africa. And let's start out with the program. So Conophytum is a genus in the family Isoaceae, and the sort of common name for that group is the mesums, after a kind of old-fashioned name for the family, which has been superseded. And it's a big family. There's about, I think, 1,800 different species in the family, sometimes quite a few more if you go by some of the old lists, divided up into somewhere in the neighborhood of 130 different genera. And they're not all, little compact succulent plants of the sort that we tend to grow on our windowsills. A lot of the mesums are shrubbier things, like there's a Lampranthes up here in cultivation in Southern California. This is a Chrysanthemum speciosum of those nice flowers. So there's a lot of shrubby things like that, which might have nice flowers in the spring, which people might grow in habitats like Southern California where they can survive, but which are probably not of a whole lot of interest to people with a little windowsill collection of succulents in New England. This sort of thing is maybe of more interest to people in the Massachusetts Cactus Club. So this is Lithops, sort of the most famous genus of living stone type succulent plants in the Isoaceae. So Lithops are about 30 species. It's one of the larger genera of sort of compact succulents with this living stone type of lifestyle in the family Isoaceae among the mesums. And this is a Conophytum, sort of a generic Conophytum minimum. There's a lot of Conophytums that have names that mean in one way or another small. They're tiny plants in general. So these individual heads here are maybe, a half or a quarter of an inch across, not gigantic things. And the plants of Conophytum are often more or less cone-shaped or obconical. They're upside-down cones with the flat part on top and the pointy part towards the base where the plant connects to the roots. Each of these bodies is composed of a pair of fused together leaves. So they've got highly succulent leaves, and they're fused together into sort of a single body with just a sort of a little opening at the apex through which the flowers emerge when the plants bloom. And Conophytums are primarily winter-growing plants. So they mostly grow during the cooler months and during shorter days. So it's an overview of the genus Conophytum. I said they're in the Isoaceae. It's about 109 different species of Conophytums. It's one of the larger genera in the family, and definitely the largest genus of the really compact sort of horticulturally interesting mesums. They're endemic almost entirely to South Africa, with a few sort of sneaking up into Namibia in the coastal regions there. And they're probably concentrated sort of right around Springbok and Steinkopf there in the northern part of the region called Namaqualand on the west coast of South Africa. Although they get down almost to Cape Town, there's a few species that grow in sort of rocky habitats around the vicinity of Cape Town, which has kind of a Mediterranean climate and a scrubby vegetation.
Move that a little further away. Yeah.
A little further away?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that better for the microphone? All right. It sounds better to me. It's not as much echoing and weirdness. It was throwing me off a little bit. So yeah, they do get down almost to Cape Town, where there's sort of more of a Mediterranean climate than a really arid climate, and out into the little Karoo, which is out east of Cape Town, sort of in the rain shadow of some mountains around the city there. And a little bit out into the interior of South Africa, especially up in that area called Bushmanland, where it's maybe not so much winter rainfall and really not so much rainfall at all. Rainfall is kind of sporadic and unpredictable. But throughout most of the range of the genus, they're in a definite winter rainfall area. Okay, so a little bit on the history of Conophytum, and culminating with this guy here, who's the world's expert on the genus, Steve Hammer, out in California now. He's trained in music, actually, and he was a professional musician, at least part-time for part of his life. But his other passion was definitely succulent plants from South Africa, and especially Conophytum. And he's done a lot of work on the group over the years. Conophytum, there was sort of a golden age of description of new species of Conophytum in the 1920s and 1930s, when people like Louisa Bolus and Annie Brown described a tremendous number of new species from all the exploration that was going on in the hinterlands of South Africa at the time, and also did a lot of work sort of moving around different species in the mesems into new genera and trying to divide up the family into sort of smaller, more manageable natural genera. At the time, before they started working, almost everything in the family was put into one single gigantic genus, Herreanthus. So some of these Conophytums that they described, they were moving them over from Herreanthus into this new genus Conophytum. A lot of new ones that they were describing just based on new material that was coming in. They described hundreds of species of Conophytum, some of which have stood the test of time and others maybe not so much. I think especially Louisa Bolus's philosophy was that she just wanted to describe any new variation that came in. She wanted to put a name on it just so there was something there for people to get a handle on. And if somebody decided in the future they wanted to sink it into different species and reduce the number of species, good for them. But she just wanted to sort of get everything out there and document as much as she could. Some people at the time called her taxonomic operation like it was like an automatic sausage factory. It was putting out species so fast. So in 1993, Steve Hammer finally decided to write his conograph, a monograph of the genus Conophytum, where he'd sort of put together all the information that was known about the genus and maybe try and reduce some of the superfluous number of species that had accumulated over the years. So he reduced the number of species in Conophytum in his 1993 book down to just 90 species from a height of, I think, maybe 400 or even more that had been described at one point or another. In 2002, he came out with a sequel called Dumpling and His Wife, where he added a few new finds. But with the conograph coming out, I think it was sort of an inspiration for people to get back out into the veld again and start looking for Conophytums and seeing what else might be out there that didn't really fit into any of the species that Steve Hammer had accepted. And so the period from, say, the late 90s or so up until today has been sort of a second golden age for the description of new species of Conophytums. So he had an additional 10 species or so when he wrote his sequel in 2002. And currently there's around 109 species. I think it's up to 109 species that are accepted today. All right, the genus is divided up into 16 sections, based mostly on things like the form of the flowers and the ecology of the plants and the form of the leaves. A little bit, to some extent, on some research that I did when I was a grad student and looked at the anatomy and sort of the microscopic structure of the plants. That's kind of been incorporated into this taxonomy as well. The 19 new species that have appeared since the conograph in 1993 fall out into 6 sections within the genus. So we've got one new species in Herreanthus here, a number of Wettsteinia, a bunch of new Minusculas, one Verrucosa, one Cylindrata, and a couple in the section of the genus called Cheshirefela. So the rest of the talk, I'm sort of going to go through these new species and talk a little bit about what I know of their history and their sort of ecology. And yeah, towards the end, I think we'll have time for some questions as well. All right, so section Herreanthus. Herreanthus is sort of the more primitive section in the genus, and I'll put primitive in quotes. All conophytums are equally evolved, but this section Herreanthus probably branched out pretty early in conophytum evolution and is not so closely related to the other species in the genus. And they tend to be a little bit different. They've still got the same leaf pairs. They produce one pair of leaves each year. The leaves are not very fused together, so it's sort of obviously a pair of leaves there on either side of the flower, and just fused together at their base in this more primitive, in quotes, section of the genus. And the new species in this section is Conophytum jarmili, also known as Conophytum danielii. And this was described in 1998, and it comes from Platbackies, where it grows on an unusual formation of rock, this sort of tough brown rock that contains a lot of iron, probably. And I don't know if it's possible to change the projector so you can see that. No, probably not. It doesn't look like it. It's up there at the top there. Well, we'll get by. Even. Yeah. Is that can we do that? Yeah. All right. So this was Conophytum jarmili here. Was all right. Nice. Was one of a pair of species that were described actually by two different guys from the Czech Republic in the late 1990s. And they were sort of stepping on each other's toes, and they published these two names, jarmili and danielii, right at around the same time, based on kind of incomplete material. And these really, you got to say, these weren't maybe the most careful descriptions in the world. So even to today, it's not exactly clear which of these names is correct for this plant. And it's maybe not also the strongest of new descriptions. It's actually quite a similar plant to a very well-known previously described species, Conophytum marginatum, which is quite common and widespread in the Bushman land area. So this is kind of really just an isolated population of marginatum is maybe the way that people will think about this plant in the future. But for now, it's considered a new species. In section Wettsteinia, there's a number of new species that have been described. This is Conophytum bachelorum here. And Conophytum bachelorum is a plant that was described in the Conograph in 1993. So this isn't actually one of the new discoveries in Conophytum. And the plant was actually discovered in the late 1970s, I think in 1979, by Anthony R. Mitchell. And he's an Englishman who spent a tremendous amount of time in South Africa in the 1970s and maybe early 1980s. He actually had a little bit of a breakdown, maybe, and he lost most of his plants, so a lot of his collection died. And he really stopped communicating with people in the succulent and succulent plant community and to other botanists. And so this plant actually sort of disappeared entirely. There was, I think, one plant in cultivation that survived in England, and that was the only specimen from which this species was known for many years, from the late 70s when it was discovered up until its description in the early 1990s, until 2004 when the original site in South Africa was rediscovered. So this was a species that was lost for quite a while. And it's an interesting thing. It flowers in the springtime, which is quite unusual for conophytums, and I have one up here. And it's got a little bloom on it right now, which you can check out later on. You can come up and take a look at the specimens I've got of some of these conophytums up front here. Almost all conophytums flower in the fall. In our hemisphere, they flower in sort of late August, September, October is when they bloom. This is one of a couple of species, just a very few number of species that flower in the springtime, right around now, for us in the northern hemisphere. And it's a neat thing. It's unusually large for a conophytum. Maybe these are sort of, the size of a nickel or so. And when they first start growing in the fall, they've got this amazing sort of fire engine red color to them. All the plants turn that color, and they sort of fade to a more greenish color as the winter wears on. So anyway, it's a neat thing. Fortunately, it was rediscovered and is, maybe sort of making its way into cultivation at this point. It was known during this time when the original site for the plants was lost, and it was represented by just a single plant in cultivation in a private collection in England. And it was actually maybe kind of the inspiration for some of the new finds in the genus Conophytum, because people were aware that this thing was probably still out there, probably hadn't gone extinct or anything like that. It was hiding somewhere out in the hinterlands where nobody had seen it in a while. So it kind of was an encouragement for a lot of succulent plant fans and botanists to get out there in the wild and look around and see what they could find. And a number of other species were discovered sort of in the course of trying to rediscover the location of Conophytum bachellorum. And this was one of these. Conophytum chrysocruxum is named after Chris Barnhill, and the cruxum part comes from the fact that around the top of the leaf there's this sort of cross-shaped reddish patch of pigment. So it's the Conophytum named after Chris Barnhill with a cross-shaped reddish patch around the top of the plant. And that's actually another spring flowerer. So it's also a plant that flowers around this time of year. Often a little bit later than bachellorum, but with that unusual spring flowering time. So it's thought to be quite closely related to bachellorum, but not the same thing. Comes from a fair amount north. It doesn't overlap with Conophytum bachellorum at all. Comes from further up north, but does flower at the same time of year, and the plant has sort of the same form as bachellorum. It's a very strong top-shaped plant. Conophytum chrysolum is named after a different Chris. It's named after Chris Rogerson. And the solum part of the name comes from from the fact that it stays a very small plant. These individual little bodies are, maybe the size of a pea or so, and it very rarely branches, so it stays as sort of a little single plant body its entire lifetime. And this has an autumnal flower, which is a little bit surprising. People thought that, again, they thought at first that maybe this was Conobachellorum having been rediscovered. Kind of realized that wasn't the case pretty early on. But then it started flowering in cultivated plants, and people realized that it had sort of the typical autumnal flowering as opposed to the spring flowering of bachellorum. So again, probably a different species. This actually goes quite close to Conophytum chrysolum. And here's another plant. It looks a lot like Conophytum bachellorum. And when I was first shown photos of this plant, I thought, well, yeah, that's just Conophytum bachellorum. And it comes from about the same place as Conophytum bachellorum on the same set of hills, so quite close by. But when this flowered in cultivation, it had these funny little darker colored flowers, kind of different from bachellorum, and it produced those flowers in the autumn, so 6 months off from when bachellorum flowers. So that kind of convinced me and some other people this was a different species. So they flower at different times, they can't cross with each other, they can't exchange genes. They're kind of isolated from each other, even though they look similar and they grow on the same hill. So that convinced us that this probably could be considered different species. And in 2015, various researchers, including myself, decided to describe this as a new species. And it wound up being called Conophytum confusum from the fact that it's easily confused with Conobachellorum. And so here's the two autumn flowering species, confusum over here, and Conophytum chrysolum here, flowering together probably in September or so. And yeah, so here's our paper. We published this in the journal Bradleya out of the UK in 2015. And some photos of the plant from the paper in the wild. Okay. In that same issue of Bradleya, there was another new species of Conophytum in this section Wettsteinia described, Conophytum crateriforme, which is fairly similar to the well-known and widespread Conophytum jucundum. It's distinguished by a few characteristics. It's a very large, robust plant. It has this very convex tops of the leaves there, or concave tops of the leaves. The leaves have this kind of sunken area around their center, which is a little bit unusual. It turns out it has the wrong sort of epidermis for Conophytum jucundum too. It's a totally different sort of epidermis at the microscopic level from jucundum, so it probably is a good species. But another one described relatively recently, just a couple years back. And I'm mostly going to stick with new species descriptions here, but this was a funny variety that was described. I'm ignoring a couple of varieties that have cropped up in the past 20 years, but I thought I'd include this one, which was just described, I think, 2017. Conophytum flavum subspecies novitium, variety Cosizenza, which is similar to the fairly common subspecies novitium, which is kind of a widespread plant, but it's got this sort of peach fuzz all over the plant. The real novitium has very smooth leaves. This one has got slightly hairy, sort of minutely hairy leaves. Okay, some plants in section Minuscula. And like I said, there's a lot of Conophytums that have names that mean small. And Conophytum minuscula here is named after, or Conophytum minusculum is the type species of this section of the genus. And these tiny little bodies here at the base of their flowers in the autumn are sort of smaller than the eraser on a pencil. There's probably 3 or 4 of these bodies could fit into the space that's occupied by a pencil eraser. And a fairly close relative, probably, of Conophytum minusculum is Conophytum pium here. And Conophytum pium grows kind of northwest of the town of Bitterfontein. Let's see, it's near the mission at Rietpoort. And so it's near the church of the mission. And so it's the pious Conophytum is how it got its name. It grows right next to the church. And it's about the same size as the typical plants of Conophytum minusculum. There's a good geographic separation between this and its nearest possible relatives in that section of the genus. This is a much more northern plant and sort of a coastal plant. And it's got these somewhat blank bodies. Typical Conophytum minusculum has a lot of red markings on the bodies. Conophytum pium has very faint sort of red markings. They're mostly just the bodies are kind of this dull gray-green color. And here's with a penny to give you some scale, the plant sort of this time of year, towards the end of its growing season. All right. Conophytum antonii is a relative of Conophytum tantillum, and this was named after Anthony Mitchell, the guy who discovered Conophytum bachellorum, so it was named in his honor. He's sort of become more active, I hear, in the Conophytum and succulent plant community in recent years. He sort of reappeared and started showing up at conventions and things like that again. So this plant was named, let's see, in 2009 in his honor. Conophytum hyracis is named after the hyrax. I don't know if you know those. They're sort of the South African equivalent of groundhogs, although apparently not related to rodents at all. They look very much like groundhogs. They're these big brown plant-eating mammals, about groundhog size. Apparently their closest living relatives are the elephants. It's a very isolated, weird sort of mammal group. But anyway, this is named after the hyrax. It grows near a place called Dasypus. And Dasy is the South African name for a hyrax, and Dasypus means what you think it means. So new Conophytum, and probably a relative again of Conophytum minusculum. Conophytum hanai, this is the other one that's named after that pair of somewhat feuding Czech Conophytum fans, Pavelka and what's the other guy's name? Halda. Pavelka and Halda both named this plant at around the same time, two different competing names. Hanai seems to be the name that's kind of won out over Thomasi, which I think is what Pavelka wanted to call this plant. But I think in this case, Halda may have got his name in a little bit quicker. So I think the general consensus is that this plant ought to be called Conophytum hanai. Kind of a neat plant in any way, no matter what you call it. It's thought to be maybe a member of this section Minuscula, and I think in the description and some of the subsequent commentary, people have thought that it's maybe related to Conophytum bicarinatum in that section. It's actually, the flowers are kind of odd for that section with these very long tubes and these kind of robust plant bodies and these thick sheaths that are brown and full of tannins. That's why they've got that brown color. It may actually be a better fit for a different section, section biloba, and maybe a relative of Conophytum bilobum. And these, the plant bodies, they've got this kind of flattened form and they're very angular. And in profile, the bodies are almost diamond shaped. And it actually reminds me quite a bit of what I've seen of herbarium specimens of another lost species of Conophytum, Conophytum semivestidum. And it's definitely not that species. It's, I think the people who found this may have come across it when they were looking for this lost species of Conophytum, Conophytum semivestidum, which hasn't been seen since its description in the 1930s. So it's maybe shows that people are on the right track when they're looking for this lost species, that they came up with this new one. Not quite the same thing as semivestidum, though. Semivestidum had hairs all over the top of the plants. And so for now, at least, that species is still only known from preserved herbarium specimens. There aren't any living plants in cultivation, and the original location has been lost. I guess in its description, the description of its location was kind of vague and maybe also wrong. So people have been searching for that for many decades, but never come up with it. But they have found some other things, like this Conophytum hanai. Okay, Conophytum brainsii here was described in the late 1990s and named after a South African researcher, Peter Brains. And this is a plant of the northern Knersvlakte, kind of in the southern part of Namaqualand. And it's unusual in a number of respects. It has kind of peculiarly cylindrical and kind of blank, featureless plant bodies. And these large yellow flowers are born in the middle of winter. It's a very unusual time for Conophytums to flower. There's really not much else at all in the way of Conophytum flowers at the time of year when it blooms, say in January or February or so. So an unusual plant in a number of respects, and undoubtedly a new species, undoubtedly a good species. Here's another case of people looking for one plant and finding something new and interesting. Conophytum bruneum grows in more or less the same area as Conophytum brainsii, the last one, but a different sort of thing. This is a sort of a normal autumn flowering plant that has big purple flowers in the autumn, so sort of typical for Conophytums that way. The bodies of the plant are quite similar to what you see in Conophytum brainsii, though, but a different color. They've got this reddish-brown coloration to them, and it's especially strongly developed in plants in habitat. I can't quite duplicate that color in Connecticut, but in habitat they're this really deep, sort of earthy-looking reddish-brown color, a little bit purplish. So that was found by Edwin Oslander, who's a succulent plant fan and grower in South Africa. Okay, Conophytum smaliorum is a recent description. Just in 2013 this was described. And it's a plant that's probably pretty similar to some known plants. It's a little bit similar to Conophytum ectypum, a little bit similar to, Conophytum turbiniforme. But maybe different enough to warrant the description. This is one of the, it's maybe a little bit of a marginal case as new species go, but for now at least considered a new species, named after the Smales, a couple of researchers and growers from England. Conophytum ermi is actually probably a close relative of Conosmaliorum and its relatives like turbiniforme and ectypum. So all sort of part of that same complex. And this and the last plant are both found in the same area east of the town of Extinefontaine, which is really the center of diversity of Conophytum. There's a tremendous number of species in quite a small area in that part of Namaqua land on the border of the Richtersveld. Conophytum ermi is named after Irma Berger, who's a naturalist living in the town of Springbok, who's very well known and has guided a lot of botanists, including myself and a lot of the people I'm talking about during the lecture today around Namaqua land and her corner of the world. Ermi was described in 1997, which was a big year for Cono descriptions. This is Conophytum cubicum, and its description was in 1999. And this grows well north of the town of Extinefontaine, which is sort of out in the middle of the Richtersveld, kind of in the middle of nowhere. This comes from way north of the middle of nowhere, up in really no man's land. It's kind of uninhabited where this plant grows, and extremely rough country. I made one attempt, I think it might have been with Edwin Aslander, the discoverer of Cono bruneum, to find this plant to sort of get up to where it grows. And we had to give up after just a couple of miles trying to drive the tracks and roads that go north of the town of Extinefontaine to where this plant was discovered. It's a very difficult to reach region. It's extremely arid and definitely quite harsh country. But yeah, so a relatively recent find. The plant, in its vegetative growth, these plant bodies look at least superficially similar to Conophytum angelici subspecies tetragonum, which has been known for quite a while, which also has this sort of square bodies, which give this plant its name. But Conophytum angelici has sort of dark-colored, small nocturnal flowers. This guy has daytime flowers, diurnal flowers, and they're huge. They're an inch or more across. They dwarf the bodies of the plant, and they're up on these very long floral tubes, so it must be pollinated by some insect like a butterfly with a very long tongue. And so the flowers are totally different from Conophytum angelici, and it's probably not related to that plant at all based on its floral form. It's So it's a pretty plant with the form of the leaves, these cubical leaves, and these very large flowers in the autumn. Sometimes in a few plants, the flowers are more of a purple color. They're generally white. Occasionally there are some purples that pop up in the wild population. I haven't seen one in person, but apparently that does occur. It's also a fairly easy plant to grow, it turns out. In cultivation, it does quite well. It doesn't really present any problems as long as you respect its winter growing period and give it a decent amount of sunlight. It does quite well in cultivation. It's pretty vigorous, actually. See if I can get this to change. Conophytum mirabile is maybe not so friendly in cultivation, but a very interesting plant. This was another one that people think was probably discovered by Anthony Mitchell in the 1970s, and he didn't really follow up on it, so there wasn't any description of this plant until it was rediscovered fairly recently. So this is a 2001 description of this plant. It grows out east of the town of Springbok, which is kind of the unofficial capital of the Namaqualand region, but sort of out in the boonies east of Springbok. It only grows in one very limited site. It's remarkable for these very long hairs all over the plants. So vegetatively, it looks like Conophytum stephanii and some of its relatives, which also have these long hairs. But those are, again, night-flowering plants. This has big purple daytime flowers, so obviously not really closely related to stephanii at all, despite the appearance of the leaves of the plant. Here it is in the wild. I visited the site where this plant grows. I think in 2004 is when I got out to the spot where it grows. And this is the place where it grows out east of Springbok. And it grows in a very unusual rock formation. It's sort of up in those hills there. And it's sort of one little area of quartzite. So it's this quartzite mountain. And it's this funny tan-colored, kind of crumbly quartzite that breaks up into little shards that cover the sides of the mountain. And it grows among the rocks and the boulders there. As far as anybody knows, just on that one hill is the entire wild population of Conophytum mirabile. And in cultivation, it seems to be a pretty slow grower and kind of finicky. So I'm not sure if it's anything that'll ever get really widespread in cultivation, even as Conophytums go. Section Verrucosa is a small section, I think just 3 or 4 species, depending on how you count them. This is Conophytum smorens caduenza from the section Verrucosa. And they're sort of window plants. They're sort of halfway to being window plants. They've got little clear areas in the top of the plant, like the Haworthia truncata that Art Scarpa showed you earlier. The windows in these are sort of only partially developed. There's just sort of these little clear dots on the top of the plant. And this is Conophytum hermarium, which is a recently described one. Just in 2000 it was described. It was actually raised up from, it had been considered a subspecies of Conophytum smorens caduenza, but was raised up to species status. So it's a sort of a new description, not really a new discovery. The plant was known for quite a while, although kind of obscure in cultivation, and exactly where it came from in the wild was obscure as well. But with some better information and some more work on it in its habitat, I think Steve Hammer and some others decided to raise it up to species status in 2000. Okay, section Cylindrata, where it's another small section, just a couple of species, where one new species has been named recently. And this is Conophytum rugosum growing in its typical habitat in pans of grit on granite mountains. So a very shallow soil, not a whole lot of soil at all. These pans probably actually flood during rains, but most of the year they dry out pretty quickly since the soil is so thin. And it's growing there with some little bulb, which I have no idea what it is, and who knows if it's even described. It might be a drymia or something. But there's the Conophytums there and some more in the background there. Members of section Cylindrata grow in this type of habitat, and they're often quite cryptic. They kind of hide down among the stones, and they're mostly buried. And this is Conophytum youngii. The leaves of the plant look quite similar to that Conophytum rugosum. It's not the best picture in the world, but it's what I could find. So that's Conophytum rugosum, and then the leaves of this plant, it also has these kind of reddish-colored leaves with a very rugose, bumpy surface to them. The flowers are totally wrong, though. This is another one that flowers off-season. It flowers right around this time of year for us Northern Hemisphere people. I just heard from Steve Hammer. I don't have this plant in cultivation, but he does. He says his plants of this are flowering right now. So it flowers 6 months removed from most other Conophytums and from its close relatives in the section Verrucosa. Flowers in the spring rather than the fall. And these very large, colorful flowers are also unusual for the section. Its potential close relative, Conophytum rugosum, has tiny white flowers, not very impressive. But so these large pink flowers or violet flowers are quite different. So I think probably a good species there. And my last section of the genus Conophytum is Conophytum section Cheshirefela, named because some of the plants sort of slowly disappear at the end of the growing season in the spring and tend to even shrink underground, and sort of like the Cheshire cat. This is Conophytum bergeri. All the species in this section are window plants, and a lot of them, some or all of the plant body is buried underground and subterranean, in the wild especially. Often not so much in cultivated plants, which we tend to grow raised up a little bit above the surface so we can see them better, and maybe also to prevent some problems with fungi and rotting and disease. But in the wild, these are often almost geophytic plants. They have most of the plant body buried underground, especially during the summer dormant period. Okay, so that was Conophytum bergeri. Conophytum bergeri was one of these descriptions from the 1930s. It's a very isolated plant. It just grows in one spot in Bushman land near a town called Auchinleck, which is kind of a little mining community. Conophytum bergeri was, so it's been known for quite a while. It's a really unusual plant. These get to be almost the size of hen's eggs, so it's pretty large for a conophytum. They almost never branch, and probably in the wild they never branch at all. It's just something that sometimes happens in soft cultivated conditions. So it's always just this, in the wild, it's always just this sort of single gumdrop shape and sort of gumdrop textured body. And it's perpetually covered on the outside by the dried up remains of old leaves. And so it gets the common name Berger's onion, which I think is sort of a made up common name. I guess all common names are made up, but this was one that the mining company assigned to it as a common name for this plant. They did some promotional materials for a while, because they have been pretty good about protecting the small site where this grows near the mines. And they wanted a common name for their publicity, for showing how they were being responsible and conserving the local flora and fauna. So it's very unusual. I think it's probably was more or less unique in the plant kingdom that this thing lives its entire life protected under the dried up remains of old leaves like that. The leaves in the wild never really break out of the dried up remains of previous year's leaves like other conophytums do during the growing season. So it's a very unusual plant. People have tried making hybrids with it. It wouldn't hybridize with anything else. So it seems to be kind of a genetically isolated plant from other conophytums. But in the past couple of years, a few probably fairly close relatives of this plant have turned up. And the first one here is Conophytum subterraneum, which was a description from 2001. And this grows pretty close to where Conophytum cubicum comes from, in this isolated area north of Wettsteinia. And it grows, it's a plant of quartz fields like Conophytum bergeri. It grows in flat areas that are covered by little quartz pebbles, and it really hides down among the quartz pebbles, and in the wild, as the name suggests, it is almost entirely subterranean. There's some larger plants not in flower. These get up to maybe the size of olives or so. So it's different from Conophytum bergeri, sort of a similar shape and similar flower structure. It doesn't hide beneath the leaf sheaths all year long like Conophytum bergeri does. And it is a much more subterranean plant in the wild than Conophytum bergeri is. So it's sort of a more underground version of Conophytum bergeri, maybe. But this was discovered by a guy named Tom Jacobs, and apparently when he found it, he was feeling very sick, and he was kind of dehydrated and exhausted, and he was poking around and just sort of looking at the ground in this flat, and he saw these little guys peeking up at him from the ground. So it might not have been found if Tom hadn't been feeling sick that day and sort of been creeping around and looking at the ground. Here's the seeds of Conophytum subterraneum and some young seedlings here, just to give you an idea of the scale of young plants of this species. A lot of the species in this section, Cheshirefela, is they have very tiny seed like this, and they probably, in the wild at least, mostly germinate underneath pebbles, so that they're really plants of these quartz fields, and these quartz pebbles that cover the ground are translucent and let through a fair amount of light. And the way these plants establish is probably mostly underneath or at the edges of these quartz pebbles, not exposed to the air at all, sort of hiding down in their own little mini greenhouse beneath the rocks on the ground surface. And only when they get a little bit older and larger do they sort of nudge their pebble aside a little bit so they're exposed to the air and can send up their flowers. Right, my last new species is Conophytum hammeri, named after Steve Hammer. And this is another probable relative of Conophytum bergeri, and it actually has the same sort of vegetative form. So this is a second species of Conophytum that perpetually hides underneath the remains of previous year's leaves and has this sort of papery covering over the plant its entire life. So yeah, these are older plants just starting to flower here. Unlike Conophytum bergeri, it has kind of dull-colored nocturnal flowers. So Conophytum bergeri and most of the other species in that section have daytime flowers or sort of evening flowers, but that are colorful and probably attract daytime insects like butterflies to pollinate them. Conophytum hammeri has nocturnal flowers. They're mostly closed up during the daytime. At night they open wide and they produce a very strong smell at night. It has the smell, I don't know if you know trailing arbutus, the local wildflower, but Conophytum hammeri has the smell of the flowers is exactly the same as trailing arbutus, New England wildflower. And it's really strong at night. If I go into the greenhouse and these guys are flowering, I often find out that they're flowering by the smell rather than even before I go over to look at the plants, because it has such a strong, sweet, spicy smell, which probably attracts moths, which pollinate them at night. Yeah. And this is sort of typical of Conophytum hammeri habitat. Hammer's onion is a much more widespread plant than Berger's onion. Conophytum bergeri grows in just one little area that's probably not a whole lot larger than this library building. Conophytum hammeri is actually pretty widespread in the vicinity of the Klein Hellskloof, the Little Hell Valley, and Navabeepseberg and the Kristallberg in sort of kind of an isolated area of the Richtersveld, but not actually, some of these sites are not too far off the beaten path, but this plant was only described in 1997 and just discovered a couple of years earlier than that. So it hid for quite a while, and I'd bet that botanists must have visited some of the sites where this plant grows over the years and poked around and maybe even stepped on it and not seen it. Some of the sites where this plant grows are actually pretty close to fairly decent roads. Some are isolated, but some are pretty close to civilization as the Richtersveld goes. And I'd bet that sites like this particularly would have attracted the attention of succulent plant growers and botanists over the years. And they must have just missed this little plant in the 1930s up until the 1990s when it was finally found and described. And here's a photograph of some of these plants in the wild. Towards the end of the flowers' lives, they sort of stay more and more open during the daytime and may attract a few daytime visitors, but especially when the flowers first open, they're really only open at night. So this is a photo from Chris Rogerson of the plants in habitat. The new version of PowerPoint has got this feature where it tries to describe a picture that you put into it and give you some sort of text description as, I guess, kind of an accessibility thing. And I remember the way it described this photo when I put it in was, I think it was a stone wall covered with snow. But that's all quartz pebbles there, and 2 plants of Conophytum hammeri there, flowering. And even with the flowers, they're kind of cryptic. And you can imagine how difficult it would be to find those plants if it was just the sort of the plant body covered up with those very pale leaf sheaths at the base there. It's almost impossible to find unless you're on your hands and knees, just examining one pebble after another until you find the thing that's not actually a pebble. And there's a couple more of these plants probably in the background there. I think I see another flower there, at least. Maybe a couple flowers there. Out of focus. Okay, so those were the new descriptions. I've just got a couple slides here of some things that have been found recently and haven't been described yet. So this is possibly a new species of Conophytum found by Andy Young, who did the description with me and some others of Conophytum confusum. He's a researcher from the UK. But near Van Ryn's Pass, we find this little plant, which is maybe related to some of the known species like Conophytum swanopolianum, but fairly different as well, with these sort of very angular, rough, ridged bodies. It doesn't exactly fit any known Conophytum, I guess. You could guess as to its relatives, but maybe a new species. And another one here, Conophytum, related to Conophytum herreanthus, but a very large plant for a Conophytum. These are apparently, each of these leaf pairs are 4 or 5 or 6 inches across. So fairly large plant for a Conophytum. And the stippling all over the leaves doesn't really fit any other forms related to Conophytum herreanthus that were known up to this point. And this was found by Florent Grenier, sort of up in the Richtersveld, in the coastal ranges of the mountains there, in a place that I guess nobody had really checked out before, because the plants were completely obvious, as you might imagine, but hasn't been described yet. It's could maybe be considered a form of Conophytum herreanthus, but it may be described as a new species at some point. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. There's a lot of area in South Africa that probably hasn't been explored all that well, and a lot of kind of remote places and also places near civilization here. This is Buccaneers Pass above the wheat fields around Cape Town, but probably not many people who are interested in succulent plants have been up in these mountains, even though we know there are Conophytums up there. And a lot of the mountains in this area, for instance, are pretty hard to access, even though they're close to Cape Town, but they are difficult to climb, and they're covered with fairly thick vegetation. So I'm sure there's new succulent plants hiding there, and definitely out in the hinterlands of the Richtersveld and Bushman land, there's other things out there that are waiting to be discovered. All right, so yeah, I guess I'll end the presentation there. Are there any questions? Oh, way in back. So the question was, what about Conophytum opeli? And I've been to South Africa 3 times, and I've never found any Conophytums that I thought were really new. One of these, actually, that Conophytum smeliorum that I went over here, I think I probably had seen those in the wild before it was described, but yeah, I don't know. I wasn't really convinced that it was a new species, so I didn't make a description. Somebody else decided to describe that one. But yeah, that Tylocoden was the one that I found that I didn't really know what it was, and other people who are Tylocoden experts checked it out and decided they didn't know what it was, and so they gave it a new name and happened to name it after me. Yeah.
So, Matt, do you have any suggestions for those of us who are not successful growing inside our houses that are on our sun porches or whatever the heck?
Okay, so Carol's question was about cultivating Conophytums in their houses. I do use a greenhouse. I've got access to the greenhouses at UConn where I grow some of my plants, but I do have plants at home as well. And I grow some of those on windowsills and some of them under lights. One of the main tricks is to give them enough light. So the plants that I have under lights are about this far from the fluorescent tubes, just a couple of inches away. And the ones that are in windowsills are definitely in a south-facing windowsill where they get full sun as long as the sun is available, whatever that might be in a New England winter. But yeah, it's hard to give these plants too much light during the winter time. During the summertime, it's they should be given a little bit of protection from full sun. It's not the sort of plant you can move out to your patio and have it cooking in full sun all day long during the summertime. So light is important. You've got to respect their growing season, so you have to really water them well in the winter time and really back off on the watering, and very little watering at all, just a little misting now and again in the summertime. Not a whole lot of fertilizer, kind of a mineral, well-drained soil mix is good. And temperature is kind of cool in the wintertime. They don't like it if your house is heated up to 68 degrees all year round. They like to cool off quite a bit in the wintertime, especially at night. They like cool nights down in the 50s or 40s.
The ones under lights, do you keep them under lights year-round?
Yeah, so the ones under lights was the question about if I keep them under lights year-round. And I do, just because it's easier that way. And I keep the lights just at 12 hours all year round. The ones under lights, I've got it set up right now so it's next to a window, so they do get some natural light, which probably helps with their photoperiod and helps to maintain their seasonal growth cycle. But I just sort of leave the timer set at 12 hours 12 hours of light a day year-round. And that seems to work out pretty well. Yeah?
Have attempts been made yet to use molecular systematics to get independent estimates of relatedness within and among the sections?
Yeah, so it's a question about whether molecular work has been done on conophytums and DNA sequencing and that sort of thing. And it would be tremendously interesting if it had been, and I'd be very curious to see what the results would be. It's getting probably cheaper and easier every week to do molecular biology work and to sequence DNA. And that's becoming one of the main ways that people tell about relationships and the evolutionary history of plants and animals these days. It hasn't been done for conophytums yet, except sort of in the broadest way. I think a few species have had some genes sequenced just to compare them to lithops and other members of the family. So on that sort of coarser level, it's been done. But one of these days, somebody will sequence a bunch of conophytum genes and figure that out, and we'll get a nice molecular phylogeny or evolutionary tree of the genus, and maybe get a better idea of how these sections relate to each other and whether they're natural groups or not, and how all the species fit together. But hasn't been done yet. There's been a few attempts, but they've sort of foundered and run aground, and one of these years it'll be done sooner or later. Yeah.
Is there a technical name for the little opening where the flower comes out?
Oh, yeah. So the question was whether there's a technical name for the opening where the flower comes out. And yeah, conophytum people call it the fissure. So, yeah, so the little space where the leaves are not fused together in the middle of the plant is called the fissure, and that's where the flower emerges. And that's where the old leaves that have dried up break apart and open up for most species during the beginning of the growing season to allow the new leaves to be exposed in the fall. Yeah?
Matt, I believe I remember that you've spent 4 winters in South Africa.
Yeah. Oh, I've been down there 3 times.
Do you have any plans to go back and do any more exploring?
Yeah, so the question was whether I plan to get down to South Africa again. So I've been there 3 times, and I definitely would like to get down there again. No immediate plans, but yeah, one of these times I've got a work out the time off and get down there during the summertime. It's it's difficult. It's expensive and it's a lot of traveling, and it doesn't make sense to go down there for just a week. You sort of want to go down for 2 or 3 weeks at least, at bare minimum, in order to make the trip worthwhile, especially if you don't really care for air travel like myself. But yeah, one of these years I'd like to get back down there and get back out into the veld again, looking for Conophytums where they grow in the wild.
You mean our summer and their winter?
Yeah, so when I've been down there in the past, the season I've been down there has been during their winter, our summer. It's sort of April or so is the best time to go down and see the flowers, since most of the species flower in the fall. More sort of June, July, August has been when I've mostly traveled down there. And that's kind of the best time to see the plants at the peak of their growing period, when they're sort of most exposed and outgrowing. It's been a tremendous drought there the past couple of years, which has maybe shown some signs of breaking this southern autumn or spring. So I guess there has been a little bit of rain in Namakwaland recently, but not nearly enough. I'm sure you've heard on the news about the water shortage in Cape Town and that sort of thing. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, there's a very small group of you in the world that study these plants. So if some kind of major decision has to be made about what's a species and what isn't, is it just the group of you guys get together and decide what you're going to do?
Yeah, so the question is about how it's decided when you name a new species. And yeah, that's a good question. I think people sort of think about it the way you described, that some group of scientists gets together in their secret lair and comes to a decision about it. And it's really a whole lot looser than that, which is how you can get situations like these 2 Czech guys trying to describe a new species before the other one and trying to beat each other out to the description. There's certain rules as to what you have to do in order to validly publish a species. You've got to deposit a specimen in a herbarium. You've got to, follow certain rules about the description and whatnot. But basically anyone can describe a species if they can get it published in what seems to be sort of a reasonable botanical journal for a species description to appear in. And, it's sort of up to other botanists whether they want to accept that description. Things sort of work out that way. There's really no central authority. We don't all get together and decide what we want to describe as a new species. I was, maybe you could sense I was sort of poo-pooing some of these new species. Some of them I think are probably not really novel. Others definitely are, I think, but other people's opinions might vary. And, eventually some sort of consensus shakes out, especially when somebody finally decides to get together and write a monograph, write a book, and sort of synthesize everything. And that's often the point where you sort of get a set of species that are generally considered as being the valid ones.
Matt, I could make a suggestion. Last month, we had a discussion about a winter species in Massachusetts, and we decided it was a new species by a vote.
Okay, we're going to have to cut it.
All right.
We're going to have to cut it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.